Good morning. I certainly never expected to be here today. By this time in my life, my family had expected that I would be a professor teaching geography somewhere, maybe floating on an iceberg in the South Atlantic. By the time I was 30 years old, I had 2 bachelor's degrees, 2 master's degrees, and was working on a PhD. Could I have some water? I'd been to the Antarctic with NASA looking for meteorites decorated with the U.S. Navy's Antarctic Service Medal and routinely presented papers at scientific conferences. Then one day, like a veil coming down, that all ended. I was diagnosed with schizophrenia. I actually remember looking at the last paper I was working on before I got sick, and it was on methane release from permafrost, and at the time there were only 10 papers written. And when I went back 15 years later, there were about 1,000 papers written on it, and it's a very major area of climate change research. I was diagnosed with schizophrenia. I, of course, knew what the word meant. My mother was diagnosed with schizophrenia when I was just 5 years old. We were that family with a sick mom. This was decades before there was any real treatment. My great-grandmother came down with dementia praecox in the 1890s and lived in an asylum for 20 years and then died in the asylum, seeing her children twice during that period of time. And it skipped my grandfather's generation and it reappeared in one of my cousins and another cousin and myself. After those first few months, when the reality of my life settled in, I can understand why some people would want to fall back onto psychosis. I had to find a purpose in my life and began volunteering. I get a lot of personal satisfaction in fighting against stigma. I'm honored to be allowed to give these speeches. I think it is important. It is easy to read about schizophrenia in textbooks, but truly understanding what it feels like takes close interaction with someone like me. Although I don't think you want to really interact closely with me today, because I have a cold. The journal Nature recently published the results of a new study into the genetics involving schizophrenia this summer. They've discovered that the genes involved include about 100, they believe now, 108 different ones. I'm grateful that they are finally beginning to understand how this horrible illness is affecting genetically. I wish it had just been 1 or 2 genes, though. That would have made it simpler to diagnose and eventually treat. And as Dr. Bland always says, schizophrenia originally, when it was described, was a group of diseases. It wasn't one disease, and now we're coming back to that form where now it's probably a group of diseases that are genetically related. The incredible number of genes involved does solve an issue that has long puzzled me. Those who are stricken with schizophrenia fall into 4 quadrants. The top 25% can go off their medications after 1 or 2 psychotic breaks and go into remission. They can have a relapse of symptoms later in life after suffering a trauma, but many lead a near normal life. They might go into psychiatry. If my jokes aren't any good, blame Dr. Bland, because I'm getting my injection. I'm rushing off to get my injection of Consta, as I jokingly say, to prevent lycanthropy. I fall into the second quadrant. With a strict adherence to my medication regime, I can have a very good quality of life. I might have breakthrough symptoms when I'm under stress or overtired, but I can survive them. You know, for some reason, most residents don't want to talk about mortgage rates. You know, I don't know why they don't want to talk about mortgage rates. They'd rather talk about how you're feeling and stuff, not about important things like your finances. Are more fulfilling than those who fall into the last quadrant. Of the bottom quadrant, 15% are permanently hospitalized or live on the streets or live in a permanent haze. The bottom 10% are dead within 10 years of first diagnosis. I actually had a cousin that this would apply to, poor David. Mainly by suicide, 40% of individuals diagnosed with schizophrenia, some have reported, attempt suicide. I get asked everywhere I speak as to why I have done so well in life in spite of this scary illness. I believe it is due to the love and support of my family and due to me never going off my medication. And of course, the dog. I have a dog, a basset hound. And he, in the tribe or the pack, my wife's at the top, the dog is next, then our adopted son, then I'm at the bottom, and the dog always bullies me. I have been blessed to live in a time and a place where there is medication to treat my condition, if not entirely cure my illness. In the beginning, though, on the old medications, I was stuck in a sedated haze. When the first atypicals came on the market a few years after my diagnosis, I was able to partially awaken from the cloud of the illness. I remember the week that I was put on risperidol, I went to the library and tried looking up books that I hadn't been able to look up, my own books that were in the library collection, and I was able to find them immediately within 5 minutes, even though for years I hadn't been able to figure out how to find them in the stacks. And that was the first realization that something was going on with the risperidol. 9 years ago, I was placed on a new type of injectable sustained release drug during a research trial. It allowed me to return to almost a normal frame of mind. I went from sleeping 14 hours a day to 7. That means I'm awake 40 hours more a week, much to my wife's chagrin. I don't know, I think spouses should be willing to talk about penguins in Antarctica at 4 o'clock in the morning, but for some reason, that's almost like abuse, I think. If I live another 20 years, this will have given me an extra 1,700 days of real life. That's a gift of life I hope I can make good on. I feel very guilty for doing so well because I know so many that aren't. At the end of the research trial, I was terrified. The medication that giving me back a near normal life was expensive and is expensive, and wasn't on the formulary. I've often thought that if I had been given this medication when I first became ill, that I could have continued on with my education and career with only a short detour rather than the permanent detour I took in the intervening time. My advocacy put me in a position to directly lobby the Premier, then Premier Stelmach, Ed Stelmach, who has been touched by mental illness in his immediate family. I put a human face to a scary illness for him, and he promised to make sure the medication was put on the formulary. He was a man of his word, and I'm eternally grateful to him for myself and those like me who have found sanity and stability due to this medication. Yet as lucky as I feel, I also feel guilty. Half of the individuals with schizophrenia aren't on a medication that can give them a happy and healthy life. I never understand why a medication that has given me my life back can't work for every person with schizophrenia. I really don't understand. Now that researchers have discovered the enormous number of genes that are involved in this illness, it makes complete sense. My medication works for me because I suppose it must treat the specific type of illness caused by the specific genes out of the 108 the researchers identified that are messed up for me. For others with schizophrenia who have a different set of messed up genes, the available medications just don't work or only partially work. For someone who doesn't respond to the available medications, life can seem unbearable and many take a permanent trip out. Some of my friends who are in that situation wait and hope for the day that a medication will come on the market that can treat their symptoms. As with all illnesses, new medications are usually expensive. That's the real economics in healthcare, balancing how much we spend versus the benefit to the individual and the society as a whole. What's the benefit of me finishing my PhD, getting the Order of Canada, having a mortgage, a dog? it matters to the dog that I'm well, compared to the cost of the medication and intensive treatment that I've received over the years. A Canadian study found the cost of schizophrenia was about $6 billion a year. These are healthcare costs that include medication and long repeated hospitalizations of those for whom the medications don't work. The losses of productivity to our economy of the 1% of the population struck down in their prime educational and wage earning years, the loss of productivity of those who must care for those who are ill. My father, his academic potential was, he was a professor, and his academic potential was muted substantially because he always had to take care of my mother when I was a child. He would have, instead of producing the 30 books he did, probably would have produced 100. And the early mortality of those with the illness. A large percentage of those of that cost is for those who fall into the bottom half of the schizophrenia pie chart. The best way we can help them and help our society is to fund research and make available every approved medication that is released. The next one could be the one that pulls our fellow Albertans out of a bottomless pit. I never want to be again. Thank you very much.